That's good. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jackie Hunt, and I want to welcome you to our presentation on the early land grants in Long Island. We'll tell you about who received the early land grants, where they were from, locate them, and walk you through our site. First, a few housekeeping items. The length of the program, we'll be talking and walking you through our website for about an hour and a half. Then we'll have a half-hour question and answer session. If anyone needs to use the restrooms, they're around the back of the building, down the walkway. It's the second green door on your right. In the back of the room, we have water and we have some cookies provided by parents. So help yourself during the presentation. I want to thank the number of people that helped us put this program together and helped us with our research. The late Harcourt Turnquest, Peter Kriska, the Anglican Church Diocese. This is Strawn at Archives. This is Tony at Lands and Surveys. Isabel Hackett, Loma Cartwright, Eliza Hackett, Robin Hunt, Amy Thornton, the Bahamas Genealogy Group, and Shirley Papa-George and the Yuma Growth Hub. Each person made an invaluable contribution to this project. First, we'll introduce those of us, the four major people who've been working on this project for 12 years now. I am Jackie Hunt, as I said before. I've been visiting Long Island for 25 years. I owned a home here for 20 years. I'm a retired public administrator and small business owner. I live in Vermont. I was informally the project manager, but informally known as the task force. I was the one that kept saying, come on guys, we gotta get this done before I'm too old to be able to travel to Long Island. So kind of push them along. Second is Anae, who is sitting over there, working on our Zoom. And Anae grew up on Long Island, Anae Knowles, correct. She was grew up on Long Island and has always had a penchant, along with her mother, for learning the history of Long Island. Anae was a history major at the University of Bahamas and graduated in 2020 with honors. She is now married to Shabazz Thomas, living in Nassau and teaching history at high school level. Anae was our primary researcher. Anae Fennell Miller, who's behind me, is a professional archaeologist and historian and small business owner. She's been coming to Long Island since 2008. She now splits her time between the state of Washington, the United States, and Long Island. Fennell was our idea person and our skeptic. We often hear Fennell say, listen guys, I don't believe what we just read. I don't think that's quite right. We need to do a lot more research. So we did. The fourth person who can't be here today is Jennifer Hackett. She lives in the state of Washington, in Ellensburg, Washington, and runs the digital mapping company. She developed the interactive map, which you will see today on our website. And this map makes it possible for us to integrate historic Long Island maps with information on the early colonists. In addition to the mapping function, Jennifer served as our website overseer. Now for a brief history of how this project came to be. In 2008, Fennell came to Long Island. She was my late husband's goddaughter. And she said, I want to come to Long Island to see where Ned built his retirement home. I had been on the dig in San Salvador, Bahamas. And I kept thinking,
That's about Long Island. propagate it.
Didn't mute that mic. Hi, can you mute your mic, please? You could go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, just 1 second here. As soon as Fennell got on the island, I started talking to her about an archaeological dig at the Adderley plantation. And when she saw the plantation ruins, I think she was hooked. So in 2010, Fennell organized a dig at the Adderley plantation. It was a 2-week dig. The first week were for the students at Long Island high schools, students in the north and students at the south. Fennell wanted to introduce the students to the field of archaeology, and hopefully it may have sparked an interest in one of them to become an archaeologist. The second week of the dig was for a few paying guests from the States and some Long Island volunteers. Those volunteers were Patsy Cartwright and Shana Cartwright from the Long Island Museum, and Anne Knowles, who heard about the dig from Susan Casca. While we were packing up the artifacts that we had uncovered at the dig and were getting ready to ship them to Nassau, we began talking about the history of Long Island and wondering about Adderley. We had first read that he was a loyalist, and then Peter gave us the information to show us that he was, I guess it was Harcourt actually. Harcourt gave us the information to show us that he was actually an old inhabitant. He was a Bahamian. I had gone to a talk that Dr. Gail Saunders gave down at North Long Island High School about the history of Long Island. And the thing that I remember the most is she said, we know very little about the history of Long Island. The one thing we do know is that the Loyalists must have been there, because when you drive the Queens Highway, you will see the names of the settlements. And many of those are the names of Loyalists. She also said that after the cotton failed, most of the Loyalists left Long Island, taking with them their slaves or selling off their slaves to other islands. So we continued to talk about this whenever the three of us were on the island. And then in 2011, Colin Brooker, a historic architect, came to the island, and we went with him to visit other plantation ruins on the island. And then I think we really got hooked on trying to find out more about these people. Fennell went to Nassau and Lands and Surveys and got a copy of the Lands and Surveys map. And I unearthed the 1792 Catmull map that's at archives in Nassau. And these two maps gave us the names of who received the first land grants after Great Britain took over the Bahamas and began issuing land grants in 1788. We were excited that we finally knew who the land grantees were, but we were a little daunted because there are 344 unique individuals. This meant trying to find historic information from the late 1700s, 344 people. In the very beginning, we just started collecting information. Fennell and Anne had theirs on their computers, and I had mine on scraps of paper sitting in an old cardboard box. We were disjointed. We didn't really quite know what to do. I think the first breakthrough is when we decided that we were going to have to shorten the time frame, that we were going to look at when those early land grants were issued, only that period of time, 1788 to 1810. That would give us a reasonable period of time to work with. The second breakthrough was in 2018, when our spreadsheet was developed. And the spreadsheet gave us a way to organize our information and to see what information was still missing.
we're presenting the information that we have gathered and the conclusions we have reached, but we are open to new information and revising our conclusions with that new information. This was the best that we can come up with information we were able to collect. I now would like to turn it over to Renee, who's going to talk about the research part of our project.
So when it comes to research and any research project, sources are the fundamental tools of your project. There are different types of sources, and they are grouped into two main groups: primary sources and secondary sources. So primary sources are sources that are firsthand information. They were from the time period that you are looking at and referring to. They would be like letters, correspondence, archival material, newspapers, photographs. And then we have secondary sources, which will be the secondhand information. And they would be like books and dissertations written on a specific time period that we would have. So for this project, we utilize a variety of different sources, both primary and secondary sources. We used quite a number of primary sources because of the originality of our project. And we try to utilize as much vital secondary sources as possible. So one of the set of sources that we're going to talk about, well, I'll speak about, is the documents that we received from the Department of Land and Survey. And this was our land grant maps and the deeds.
Land grant map, just a second.
Yes. So we'll display it on our screen.
Just a second.
So the land grant map, which we'll display in a second. Okay. It gave us an outline of
Do you want me to?
yes, the land and survey copy. So it gave us an outline of the properties on Long Island, which was split up into about 7 or 8 pages, large copies. We scanned those copies. It outlined the different properties throughout the island. And this gave us a better idea of who received what property throughout the island of Long Island for our project. This also assisted us with our GIS mapping portion of the project. And it helped us to better outline on the GIS map where each of the grantees' property was, the shape, the boundaries, and the sizes as well. Additionally, from Land and Survey, we received deeds and their dates. And these deeds were a document that showed the owner, the grantee, the portion of their property, the outline of it, the shape of it, and it also gave the boundaries and the amount of acreage for the property. Next, we also went to the Department of Archives, and at the archives, we utilized documents. Oh, this is a copy of a deed, but I will speak to this portion because these would be sourced in from our archive records. So one of the set of documents that we utilized were documents from the diocese records, the Anglican diocese
I'm so
records.
sorry.
And this would include birth, marriages, and death certificates. Specifically, the earlier records was our main focus because we wanted to use this information to identify those persons who were living in the Bahamas prior to the 1780 Loyalist influx. So within this portion, we came across a lot of different names within there, but a few of them, because names are so similar. For example, in my Knowles lineage, we like to use John. So you have like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, John Knowles. And so it's hard to differentiate, but unique names that stood out, we were able to utilize the Anglican diocese records to let us know that they were present, either being born or married or died prior to 1780s. We also utilized and found the Tatnall map, which Jackie briefly mentioned in her speech. And this was the first map of Long Island, and this was dated 1792. And the Tatnall map, I'm not certain, some of you Long Islanders may refer to, yes?
That's right. Okay, here we go.
So everyone can see the screen now, and the Tatnall map. So,
Loud,
oh,
loud.
okay, so the Tatnall map is the first map of Long Island, and it was dated 1792. And it was done by Josiah Tatnall. He was the Surveyor General at the time, and he was in charge of doing these maps throughout the island, and he did this map of Long Island that we have and we utilized for our research project. It gave us the listings of the first grantees during this time who received land portions from the government. And it was very useful and instrumental in our research project. We utilized it to compare it to, we utilized it to compare it to our map that we received from Land and Survey and cross-reference to make sure that the grantees on this map were the same as the ones on Land and Survey. And we will speak to that later on in our presentation. We also utilize colonial office records from the archives, and these are also known as CO records. But we had a strong focus, you could put that there, on the CO23 records. And these were original correspondence relating to the Bahamas over time. And so these correspondence would be between the governors and persons in power during the time, between here and England, and throughout the country. And this is where we also found records that were documented by these persons in power. For example, there was a formal system of land grants at the time. And so this is where we would find the earlier records of these land grants throughout here. Within here, we came across the 1740 census at the time. And within that, we came across a few of our families that was on this Tatnall map. For example, I know you cannot see it at all on this map, but one of the family names that we did find on the census record was the Bunch family. So why I chose this particular one, if anyone is from Long Island and know, was a settlement called Bunches. And so we found the Bunch family of John Bunch and George Bunch and their sister. And that's who the settlement was named after, because they each had properties within the same area, and so they grouped it as bunches. So they were on the census of 1740, which meant that they were in the Bahamas prior to the 1780s time period of the Loyalists, and we were able to identify, well, that was one indication to say that they were old inhabitants as opposed to Loyalist inhabitants. Okay, so these records, the CO23 records, they are on my archives on two separate fields. Our focus was the earlier field that stops about 1750s. We briefly touched on the later field, but we still have room for improvement. We continue to look on that second reel to find information. And we also utilized this first reel to look for any information that would speak to some form of settlement on Long Island prior to 1780s period. We did not come across anything that was solidified. We did see mention of other out islands briefly, but nothing specifically on Long Island. So we will continue our search for the second phase of the project. And bear in mind that these records are also not in chronological order. So if anyone is interested in looking at any of these documents, you're going to need quite some time. So sit down and review and read the script if you're interested. Another set of documents that we utilized was the Latter-day Saints records, also known as the LDS records. And on the Latter-day Saints. With the Latter-day Saints records, we accumulated deeds, indentures, and other 18th century documentations. The deeds that we found would be the earliest sample that Chanel showed. You could pull that up. These would be the ones that were
Apparently, by the person feedback.
at the archives.
Hang on, I'm a historian, I don't know this, how to do this.
Right there. So these would be the documents that we saw from the Latter-day Saints records or the LDS records. This would outline the name of the grantee. It would state where the property was located with the different boundaries. For this example, we have Abraham Adderley. It states the amount of acreages he has, and it also tells us the boundaries. So bounded by the south by vacant land, northerly by Abraham Pratt land, and on all other sides by the sea. These were very useful records that we utilized for this project. We also incorporated them into our websites when we found them. So you will see them throughout the website. We also secure indentures, and these are legal agreements or contracts. And these mostly show the passing of property from one owner to the other, if it was sold or if it was given as a gift. These would be outlined within the indenture itself. It would also give us the boundaries and who the property passed on. This was useful in our research portions in which we found that there were persons on the Tatnall map who weren't present on the land survey map. Okay, next we utilized published book sources, and we had a large array of published books that we utilized. One that Jackie found that was very, very useful was the parish documents, and this gave us a better understanding of those persons who were loyalists, and it helped us to identify those loyalist settlers who came here and got granted land in Long Island. We also used a large amount of journal articles, so online journals, printed the Bahamas Historical Society journals. I think we have maybe 3 complete collections amongst us. And these were articles written by local and foreign historians about places on, well, not Long Island specifically, but persons and different topics throughout the Bahamas. We also utilize ancestry.com. So while most of us may see the commercials about ancestry and think it's only to figure out where we are from by sending in our DNA samples, you could also utilize Ancestry for learning more about your family tree. So there were family trees online, as well as attached to those trees were documents submitted by persons. These were scanned copies of original documents, and we were able to utilize that, as well as utilize their library of documents that they have on their website. And another online source that we utilized was Bahamas Genealogy, of the website. This is where you would get access to the LDS records, and also Bahamas Genealogy Group. And this is a group of Bahamians and Bahamian descents living abroad locally, who are all interested in family and family heritage and learning more about where they came from. And they gathered a lot of documents and shared them amongst themselves and others who were coming in and asking questions about their families. So they shared files, photos, all of which was useful with us with our project and our research. So with that being said, would like Mel to come and take over and talk a bit about our mapping and our mapping system.
Okay, you drive.
You drive.
Okay, everybody wake up? Yep. I have a really loud voice, so I apologize in advance. They used to call me Sarge. Anyway, I'm gonna talk about the mapping, which was a beginning part for us, and it was very complicated. We started out, as Anay said, with 8 oversized maps. They're each about this big, and they were paper. And I received a copy of them from the Bahamas Lands and Surveys Department in about 2011. And so, as Jackie mentioned, in about that same time, 2011 or 12, she was also able to identify the Tatnall map. And so let's go down to the land survey map again. And let's go to Denman's Key. Should be map 4, I mean, map 5, sorry, map 5. So the first thing we had to do was we scanned them, which involved sticking these large paper maps through a piece of equipment that turns them into a digital or electronic record. And so these maps got scanned, and we ended up with these. We can finally zoom in, zoom out really easily to see who the landowners were. And again, we have a lot of information on these. We have the number of acres, we have the name, and we have a deed number, Those are recorded in a book in the Department of Archives. And I think they're also a copy in Lands and Surveys. The thing about these maps is we never knew, and we still don't know for sure, how this map was created. The best of our knowledge is it was some industrious employee in the Department of Lands and Surveys, probably in the 1970s, and they took a topographic quadrangle map, which means a map that shows the ups and downs, the high points and whatnot of the landscape, and they plotted on to the best of their ability the deeds from the 1700s, and they tried to figure out where they were. One of the interesting things that we found in this is that there are far more acres on Long Island than were officially deeded. So, for instance, this is just no relationship to reality, but it says Marmaduke Right, 200 acres. We found out that when we plotted that, and I'll talk about this in the next stage, it was actually more like 300 acres. So the question becomes, where are these pieces of land really? It was very interesting discovery, not a part of what we set out to do, and not legally binding, so don't come to us and say, where's my extra 50 acres? But it was interesting to note that the surveys were not terribly accurate. Another thing that we noted was that the names of the spelling of the names. We have here John Reynolds. Can you see this here? Yeah, there.
Yeah,
That makes
right
up the cursor. He was listed on the other map as John Raydols, Raydols. Now, Raydols and Reynolds are not very close, and they don't sound very much alike. So it took us a very long time to figure out how to match up these strange spellings of names. Sometimes it was just off by a letter, no problem. Okay, so we had these maps, we scanned them. The next thing that had to happen is they had to be rubber sheeted or georectified. That is, you have a piece of paper, and that's fine, but where is it in the world? And so Jennifer Hackett, our amazing GIS person, was able to register this. That is to take it and say, okay, this corner is in Stella Maris right here, and this corner is in Bunches right here. So that's where this map sits on the landscape. It's called georectifying. Once that was done, somebody had to digitize, you want to do the boundaries?
Yes.
And we digitized the boundaries of the settlements as well as each individual grant. No, just go ahead, some money. So for instance, where it says John Newman, or wherever, here, just choose one. John Newman or Roger Poe, each of those had to be traced on a computer after the map was registered in space. They had to be traced, and then data had to be entered for the name of the landowner, how many acres, and the deed number. That's all we started out with in our spreadsheet. So then we had the Lands and Surveys information, and we were pretty sure that it reflected the original Crown grant. That is, in the 1780s, when the Crown of England said, okay, yes, people, you can have this land, you have to pay us a rent on it, but you can own the land otherwise. This is what happened. Then we found that a lot of the people who were on here, 118 of those 344 landowners, were in fact a group that we'll talk about later called presumed late grantees. That is, that the Crown had given the land early on, and then because the people didn't do anything with it, or they died, or they moved away, the Crown took the land back and reissued it. Okay, let's do Tatnall. So that's one set of maps. We had to do the same thing with the Tatnall map.
Just a second.
And you'll remember, this is the Tatnall map. It's incredibly inaccurate. This was called the Tatnall map because it was drawn by a man named Josiah Tatnall, who was then the Surveyor General of Bahamas. And we think that he sat at his desk in Nassau and just went, okay, you do this, do this, do this. Because when you look at the actual outlines, except for some, you can see Indian Hole Point there, but where Shea Pierre is. That is one of the few places that is easily recognizable, both on today's map and the Tatnall map. When you get down to, or when you get up north, down north, as they say here, in the area of, there, that one piece of land that looks like an island is in fact not an island. That is burnt ground, the backside of burnt ground, and it matches nothing in reality and nothing on the landed survey map. So Jennifer had to be extremely creative in how she stretched it and moved it to make it overlay. So GIS is about overlaying. You take a map electronically and you have another map and you overlay them. And you can do that with an endless quantity of maps. So instead of trying to flip back and forth to see which map matches sort of roughly, the computer does it for you and it does it exactly, which is really wonderful. So anyway, they had to try and make the land and survey map match with the Tatnall map. And then we put it all together and we created the most important piece of this, which is the interactive digital map. And this is what that looks like. We did it so that each individual, particularly Long Island property owner, can find where they are, where their house is. We'll just randomly zoom in.
Okay.
Way in. Way in. Okay, so you can find things like, okay, the Queens Highway. You want to show me what the highway is?
Oh, yes.
Yep, there's the Queens Highway. Find that, and then you can zoom in on specific houses, buildings, your store, your house, and you can then click on it. Let's do that property there. Click on it. And you find out that the original landowner was a man named John Duncan, who was also referred to as John Dunn, another tricky one. We had a long time to figure that one out. And that he got his land grant in 1788, was 180 acres. And so he is an old inhabitant. That means that he was not coming to the Bahamas as part of a wave of the loyalists. We should back up a little bit because unfortunately, I guess we haven't discussed the loyalists versus the old inhabitants. So that was the most important part of this project. And I'll take a moment here to talk about that in a few minutes here. So anyway, we now have this wonderful interactive map, and we have it by Google Earth or a satellite photo in the background, so you can zoom in, zoom out, wherever. But what we also want to do is we zoom out to the Grantees, my legend, all the way up. Right there, base map for photo Grantees. Okay.
Over here.
Yeah.
Right, there we go.
So then we color coded all of the Grantees. I want to zoom in. And we'll talk about this again more in just a few minutes here. But that's a little too far. So we were really interested in noticing patterns. We found that groups of people settled in the same area with their compatriots for the most part. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But anyway, the bottom line is you can now zoom in on a parcel that you own or that that you're interested in or that you're driving by, because we made this so that you can find your location in real time. You can use this website. It's not an app yet, but it's a website. Use the website on your smartphone, and you can drive in your car and you can say, "Oh, I see a wall there. Oh, I see a ruin. Where am I? And whose grant was it in 1788?" For 344 landowners. It's took a ton of work. You have no idea. Back and forth about where it is. So that's there. The legend will come up and it shows which color is which. We'll talk more about this in a second. And you can also search this map. Well, I guess we'll talk about more. No, let's go to this.
No, wait, someone might unmute it, I think.
Can you hit search?
Yes.
So in the search function, you can put in let's do Knowles. Lays and Knowles. So we're looking for any of the Knowles. Wait,
Somebody. Am I-
oh, good. Yeah, if anyone watching remotely, could you please mute your Zoom? We're having a hard time with your voices and your children's voices in the background coming through, so it'd be great if you could mute. Anyhow, so search, we've searched for Knowles, hit search.
Did search.
Wow. That's did you spell Knowles right? What the heck?
Yeah,
Oh, that's really weird. Maybe try Adderley.
Adderley. Specific. We could look for a specific person.
Wow, I don't know why this isn't working, but it was working until about 2 hours ago. You can search for a person and it will show with a red box on the map where that person had land. Not just one grant, but every grant they may have had will show up on the map. Okay, let's give up on that.
Okay.
And yeah, that's it for me for the mapping. And now we're going to talk about grantees and how to use the website. And I guess that starts with me here. As I've mentioned, Jackie mentioned, there are 344 unique individual grantees. 64 of those were loyalists. So, you know, less than a fifth of them were loyalists. And we're going to start with Peter Dean.
Okay. Oh,
Second column.
oh, right there. Sorry.
So Peter Dean, again, let me back up with the loyalists and the non-loyalists. So our project started because all of the history books that you Bahamians are used and all of the publications we could find with tourism and anybody else said Long Island was basically uninhabited after the Lucayan Indians were taken away or killed by the Spanish under Columbus. So about 1540, the Bahamas were said to have been completely unpeopled. There's more to that story, but not part of this project. Then the story goes that the out islands like Long Island had no people here until the Loyalists arrived from the US, and I'll tell you about the Loyalists in a second, starting after 1784. So that all these people who came were white, wealthy plantation owners, cotton farmers, cotton planters from the US or the 13 American colonies, and they came with dogs and slaves, and they changed life forever on Long Island. And what we found, just to sort of cheat here, is not true, not true at all. So the loyalists, we call them American loyalists, and we need to define that term really specifically. Your history books, if you're a Bahamian, says that the loyalists were these people who came to the Bahamas from the 13 American colonies after the end of the Revolutionary War in the US and America. We are defining American loyalists a little bit differently. We are defining American loyalists as more specifically people who had been living in the 13 American colonies and had taken the side of the British Crown against the rebel patriot Americans. They had taken the side of the British Crown, and because of that, the brand new American government had kicked them out. They had taken their lands and they said, "You're traitors, you cannot stay in these 13 American colonies anymore." So as each battle was lost by the British, by the Loyalists in the 13 American colonies, they moved south. If they were Virginia or South, they moved south. And the first place they ended up with is in South Carolina, in Charleston. So everyone was hanging out in Charleston, pissed off, very annoyed that they had lost their land in Virginia or North Carolina, but hoping for the best, assuming the crown would eventually be victorious. Well, that didn't happen. And Charleston, South Carolina then fell to the Patriots. And so the people moved further south to Savannah, Georgia. And that didn't hold. And then they were out of territory to move south in, because at that point, the 13 American colonies only went as far south as Georgia. So they needed to find some place outside of those colonies to flee to. And the natural place was Florida. At that time, Florida was divided into two pieces. There was East Florida, which is basically the coastline of what is now the state of Florida, and what they called West Florida, which went from the center, what is now the center of the state of Florida, all the way to New Orleans. It was a big chunk of territory, West Florida back then. East Florida was under British control. West Florida was nominally under British control, but it was the wild, wild west. There were Indians and there were trappers and there were people that didn't fit in society everywhere else. This was sort of a very loose, lawless place. It was a great place to be if you just couldn't make it under the strictures of British rule at the time. So eventually what happened was in 1782, Spain took over the Bahamas. I don't know if you all know that, but Spain got the Bahamas for about a year, year and a half, from 1782 to 1783. And when Spain took the Bahamas, the people who were living in the Bahamas had to either hold up their hands on a Bible and say, yes, I am now a Spanish citizen. You can imagine how well that went over, or I'm out of here. So a lot of Bahamians left Bahamas at the time because they did not want to say, they did not want to be Spanish citizens. Where do you suppose they went to? Florida. And so in Florida now, you have people who've moved south from the American colonies, and you have Bahamians who've moved north from the Bahamas, and they're all hanging out there. Well, in 1783, the Treaty of Versailles, ended all of the American Revolution. It settled some things between France and Spain and England. And guess what happened? Spain took Florida. And Andrew DeVoe, who you Bahamians have all heard of, he was living in Florida at the time. He was a loyalist, so he was loyal to the British Crown. He got himself some folks from Florida, other loyalists, and he said, I'm going to go take Nassau for the British people. Loyalists, why not? So he gathered up some other Floridians, but you know what he also did? He also went to Eleuthera. And the history books tell you a couple ragtag guys from Eleuthera went with him. We found out that it was a vast majority of the people, the men as soldiers, who took back Nassau for the British Crown. They were Eleutherans. They were old inhabitants. And then these men got given the title loyalists. That's very important as we go further here. So, I'm sorry, I talk too much. So anyway, we have the loyalists. And in 1783, after Florida became Spanish again, and Bahamas became English again, the British Crown said, okay, you loyalists living in East Florida, we want to thank you for your loyalty to the Crown, and we want to encourage development and habitation of the Bahamas. So I'll tell you what, you loyalists come to the Bahamas, and we'll give each of you who is a head of household 43 acres. And we will give your spouse, and we will give your children, and we will give your slaves, well, not give your slaves, give you for your slaves 20 acres apiece. So if you are a man with a spouse and 3 kids and slaves, 10 slaves, you get a pretty good chunk of land. And the idea was we want them to start producing something with this land. And because they were loyalists, they all had what I would refer to as cotton fever. They thought that if they grew enough cotton, they would all be wealthy and life would be good. And they would be living just like they lived in the American colonies with their vast plantations and their grand houses and whatnot. Didn't always work out that way, but that was the plan. But at the same time, the Crown did not distinguish between loyalists and old inhabitants, except in one way. The old inhabitants were also given 40 acres and 20 acres, but the loyalists did not have to pay the Crown rent for 10 years. And their deeds say, who's the one else? Archibald Taylor, comma, a loyalist. That's the title of his deed, his grant. And then in the body of the document, it says that he shall be exempt from paying quit rent for 10 years. That's our way of knowing that this was a loyalist, or it's one way. The old inhabitants, same thing. It would say Abraham Adderley, comma, his children, heirs, whatever, but he would only have a 2-year quit rent. So anyway, back to the map. Oh, no, sorry, not back to the map. Sorry. Archibald, well, let's talk about Archibald.
Oh, sorry. I was just pulling up. the-
No, it's okay. I don't think you can see it. You can't zoom in far enough, can you? Oh, you can. Can you scroll? By the way, these are deeds from 1788 and 1789. These are copies of the original deeds, which I think is kind of amazing. When you think about the hurricanes, the floods, the fires, the change of ownership back and forth between London and here, it's pretty amazing that we have as many documents that have survived as we do. So you can see here, it says Archibald Taylor, comma, a loyalist, his heirs and assigns, blah, 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 then it mentions 300 acres, etc. Archibald Taylor is an example of a loyalist, for sure. We struggled with who was and who wasn't. As Anay said, she went through the documents we found, the censuses of the earlier 1700s. We have a 1731 census, a 1734 census, a 1740 census. We have poll tax records, which is where if you wanted to vote, you had to pay. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I won't make a political commentary on that. Anyway, so there were poll tax records. There were also records of land that was owned in Nassau by lots. Anybody who was basically here before 1780 could not have been a loyalist. They were living in the Bahamas, and by our definition, they don't fit it. They were already here beforehand, old inhabited.
I'm sorry, where's the assumption I came from?
Oh, we'll get to that. Yeah, I promise. In about 2 seconds. No, about 2 minutes. So anyway, Archibald Taylor. Archibald Taylor was a really important loyalist. The reason he's an important loyalist is he's basically the founder of Clarence-town. Can you zoom into Clarence-town?
Oh,
For Archibald Taylor.
Archibald Taylor, getting him.
Oh, sorry. There he is.
Where? Sorry,
Clarence-town.
right here. Okay.
So what we have on this website for you to use, and we're going to give you the link. You can go off after this and play with it yourself. Look for your favorite person, look for your favorite land. Archibald Taylor owned, amongst other things. Can you scroll down a little bit? There we go. So each of these insets, you'll see, yeah, thank you. The pink insets there are the actual grants that these people owned. And in this instance, again, you want to scroll down a little bit, go down.
Oh, sorry. I'll just close.
We have, this man owned, I think he owned 5 actually.
Yeah.
He owned 5 different grants, all in the Clarence-town and Miley area. So he basically owned most of Clarence-town. And he and his brothers, Alexander and Duncan, between them, locked up most of Clarence-town. He's the one who named Clarence-town. He owned a settlement called Great Harbor, which sometimes you see referred to as Clarence-town still. He also started a settlement called Victoria Village. Victoria Village isn't really there today. You can see a couple of little ruined buildings in the bush. But Victoria Village was set up to accommodate freed slaves, liberated Africans, basically anybody who was not white, who they wanted to have a special place reserved for, because when you free a slave, that's wonderful, but where do they go? They have nothing. So there needed to be a place for them to go. So Victoria Village was one of his. Okay. Oh, and he had come from Scotland, as most of the grantees on Long Island had. We were surprised to note that. But the Taylors, the Campbells, gosh,
Wins.
what's that?
Wins.
Wins, well, yes.
No,
You're doing keywords.
Okay.
Sorry, who's my next one? I'm sorry, I guess I know this a little bit too well. I watched that brain here. Let's do Alexander Wiley.
Okay.
Alexander Campbell Wiley was a gentleman from Georgia, and his land was attainted and is taken back by the government, and he was accused of treason. And he was by then.
Right here.
And he owns land in 3 different places in Long Island. He owns it in Wims and in Gordon's in the far south, and where else? White House settlement. And so You can find where exactly they are. You can look at the map. The star will tell you roughly where to look on the map. And then the inset box will show you exactly where to go to the interactive map and look them up. Want to scroll down a little bit? Yes. So anyway, Alexander Campbell Wiley. My mother actually, strangely enough, became friends with an Alexander Campbell Wiley living in Florida at the time. And he was Alexander Campbell Wiley, I think the 11th. These people were not creative in their naming, and they just recycled the same name over and over again. The Wileys were Scottish. They'd been living in Georgia. Alexander, our grantee, Alexander Campbell Wiley, the third or whatever he was, had been living in England. He came at the outset of the war to fight for the British Crown. Then he went to Nassau. We don't know that he ever actually lived in his plantations here on Long Island, but as I said, he found 3. In the end, the Wiley family gave up in the Bahamas, and who hadn't died here went back to Georgia. And so now there are Wileys living in coastal Georgia today. I'm going to skip the third loyalist and just move on to the old inhabitants.
Okay.
So old inhabitants, let's start with Abraham Adderley. Near and dear to our hearts, because as we mentioned, our very first project on Long Island was an archaeological investigation of the Adderley's plantation. The way the grantee section in our website is set up is you first have a list of all grantees, and it's alphabetical. This should be very easy. Obviously, you can click on A and get to Adderley. You can click on W and get to Wiley, but we're going to start with Abraham Adderley. But he's also listed in the grantee section. It's broken out old inhabitants, loyalists, and other categories, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Right.
So let's click on old inhabitants. Let's go to
Scroll down.
Yeah. Okay. So Abraham Adderley was always said to be, he was a loyalist, he was a loyalist, he was a loyalist, but he was not a loyalist. We have conclusively shown that he is not a loyalist. He was part of the family that was living in Bermuda, along with many other Long Island early grantees. There was a very large Bermuda connection. And the Adderleys, and as I mentioned, he was the third, fourth, or fifth in line of Abraham Adderleys. It was pretty easy. It's not a very common name in 1700, so it's pretty easy to track. He was born in 1735. He and his ancestors had basically sailed around the Caribbean. They were in Jamaica at one point, they were in Antigua. They were looking for a place to land in the Caribbean or West Indies that was outside of Bermuda. Bermuda was very full by 1700, I should mention. By 1680, Bermuda was very full, which is really early on, and we were surprised to learn that. So people went out to make their fortune. The Adderleys were mariners. They were really, their whole lives were tied up in the sea. They had salvaged a number of shipwrecks, and one of them found thousands of pounds of silver bullion and salvaged it from a shipwreck. So by the time they got to the Bahamas, there was some money. They were wealthier old inhabitants than others. Got a lot of information here. Abraham Adderley grantee page probably has the most information because of all the research we were required to do in association with the excavation permit we got.
We're still going.
And we're still working on it. So suffice to say that Abraham Adderley's plantation, according to his will, was not a cotton plantation, and he was not a loyalist. His big thing, and that of his descendants, was raising livestock. We have horses, something called horned cattle, which we've gone round and round about and think that that must mean longhorn cattle. He has another category called stock, which I believe is short longhorn or no horned cattle. Pigs, goats, anything was livestock. And he also had salinas, which are the salt pans. And so, like other plantations on Long Island, the Adderley plantation, they almost certainly slaughtered animals and sold them to passing ships. And a lot of these plantations would have a central flagpole, and they would raise a flag high on the hill that could be seen both on the Atlantic side and the Caribbean side to let people know which commodities they had for sale. And it's very likely, well, it's 1790 and you have just slaughtered an animal. You're not gonna be able to sell it in 20 minutes or an hour. And say it's August and it's stinkingly hot outside. You need to salt that really quickly because that's the only means of preservation you have at the time. So these salt salinas would have been very important because that's where they rake the salt used to preserve the meat on these livestock plantations. Adderley was also continuing to be a merchant. He was sailing around the West Indies. He was growing subsistence crops, et cetera, et cetera. As I said, we have his will, so we pretty much know about him. Then let's do Thomas Smith.
Okay.
So Thomas Smith was another old inhabitant who is said to have been a loyalist. We believe that our Thomas Smith was not a loyalist.
Where is he?
Smith. Yes. Thomas Smith apparently was a very important person. First of all, he's listed as Thomas Smith Esquire, which if today's definition holds in the past, and we haven't really been able to find that out, he was probably trained as a lawyer. Thomas Smith received 300 acres of land in the Clarence County area of Long Island, which is very interesting because today the Smiths are predominantly in the North End, in Seymour's and somewhere other places, but mostly concentrated in Seymour's. So it's very interesting that Thomas Smith's original land grant was in Clarence Town. Thomas Smith is all over the Bermuda records. And we believe that he was an Lutheran adventurer who came in 1647 to the Bahamas. The Smith surname is listed in all the earliest records. And Thomas Smith specifically, not just Smith, but because Smith, oh my goodness, Thomas Smith even is a very, very common Anglo, British name. And so it's very difficult when you have loyalists with the same name to separate out who were these people. John Wells is another one. John Wells, everyone knows who's into history. Everyone knows that John Wells was a very famous, well-known printer in Charleston, South Carolina. He was a very, very prominent loyalist. And then we have a John Wells printer who came from Florida to Bahamas, and he was a printer in Nassau, and he was very pro-Crown, of course. And everyone has, I think, assumed that that is who the John Wells on Long Island was, but it is not. We have John Wells in all of the old records long before the American Revolutionary War. So here's Thomas Smith in the same situation. Thomas Smith signed dozens. I mean, we haven't gone through them all, but probably 100 or more, would you say?
Yeah.
I mean, tons and tons of records, legal records. Wills, he was an executor, he was a trustee, he signed it as a witness. Indentures, he was constantly buying and selling land, he was signing other people's land. But we think that he was an old inhabitant. His, again, going back to the grants I told you about, his grant does not say loyalist, and his quit rent waiver is only for 2 years. So those are another likely suggestion that he was an old inhabitant. He had a lot of slaves. And in 1834, which is, of course, the last year the slave register was filled out because that's the year of emancipation in the Bahamas, he had a lot of slaves, we just say that. Yeah, okay, and so the other thing that I didn't mention is we have some references on the bottom of each grantee page. So you're welcome to go look these up yourself. This one says the census of 1740, Johnson's records, which is where wills and things are, marriages, baptisms. The diocese records are the things that we found in archives in the Bahamas. Homeward HB is Homeward Bound. It's a seminal Bahamian historical book, and the land grant itself. So those are some examples. They should hopefully correspond pretty well with the bibliography we have. And finally, James Knowles. The reason we included James Knowles is he has a secret. He is somebody that we found very interesting. And it was only through the work of the genealogists in the Bahama genealogy group that I was able to find this out. James Knowles.
Gonna pull him up right now.
Second.
Senior.
Senior. James Knowles Senior, again, another group that was like James. So James Knowles Senior first appears in the records in 1733 when he was baptized in Nassau at Christ Church Cathedral, or Christchurch,
Yeah.
Christchurch, sorry, it wasn't cathedral.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it is now, but it wasn't then.
Yeah.
There we go. And James Knowles was listed by the baptizing preacher as being about 10 years of age. So it's not uncommon for people to save up, if they were living on an out island, they didn't come immediately, they didn't hop a ship immediately to Nassau to have their children baptized. They might save up and take 3 or 4 at a time. They might have been 2, they might have been 10, whatever. So James Knowles was baptized probably he was baptized in 1733, probably born about 1723. The thing that makes James Knowles interesting, first of all, he was one of the earliest grantees on Long Island. He was probably here in the 1740s, along with Sims, Foxes.
Yeah, just those.
Sims and Foxes for sure. I think the Forsyths, although the Forsyths are strangely not a grantee name, but anyway. Foxes and Knowles. Okay, so they were the earliest grantees, and their grants were one of the earliest settlements on Long Island, which is the Crossing, which is now Emma in our audience owns property there, so she's thrilled. Anyway, the Crossing is now today's, and for those of you that don't know, is now today's sort of south end of Salt Pond, north end of Flinders. It's in that area, and that was the original settlement on Long Island, and Knowles had his land there. The other interesting thing is that we found that Knowles's and Sims, keep going. Oh no, I guess that's not it. Well, we have a list somewhere else, and I can't remember all the families. These were all families of color. These original people who started the original plantations here were not white people. They were listed in all of the records as, quote, free black or mulatto. Is that right? Or
Yeah.
free mulatto or black.
No, free black and mulatto.
Free black and mulatto. And so we think it's very interesting that the earliest folks here were not white people. They were people of color. They had substance. They had owned as slaves. I don't know. It's just surprising to me, I suppose. But the biggest thing about James Knowles, the most interesting thing, is that recent DNA studies, Anae is one of them. She submitted her DNA. There's a large Knowles DNA group in the Bahamas that have tried to piece together the Knowles lineage. And Anae and all of her family members, the Bahamian Knowles, many of the Bahamian Knowles, are not related to any other Knowles anywhere in the world. But they have this strange ancestor that none of them knew about, which is Rogers. So our best guess, and I shouldn't say our because I'm not doing work on that, they are the Bahamian genealogists and the DNA folks presume that a Rogers boy was raised by John Knowles. And that was James or someone before him. Because by James Knowles, which is where everybody branches off of, they were Rogers biologically, but Knowles by name. And although a lot of genealogists think that this Rogers was in New England, I find it very interesting that there was a Michael Rogers who was living next to James Knowles in several locations on Long Island. And he also signed as the executor of James Knowles' estate. So there was this long connection, I don't think it's chance, between James Knowles and this Rogers family. And now we know that the Knowleses are Rogers, amongst other things. It's very complicated. Trust me, it's very
Shocking.
complicated. But anyway, that is the one piece of news we have about that. Okay, so Jackie is now going to talk about old family names. Do you want me to drive? Okay.
Oh, I can, yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to say I don't have very interesting stories about the old people who identified as old family names. There are 32 of them of the 344. And these were people who we were able to find the surname of the family in old Bahamian records, the census and such. but we couldn't find the surname and the first name that matched our grantee. One example would be Henrietta Current.
Okay. Right here.
You can see Henrietta received 40 acres of land in 1790 in the old Grays area. And when you read this, you will see that the current name has been in the Bahamas for, well, since 1704. We found it in the 1731 census, the 1770 census. We found that in the 1740 census, the Leo Anderson is listed with her son Peter Current. It is clear the current name is Bahamian.
Who's conducting the census,
The British Crown, through the local Bahamian government.
even though it was prior to the Loyalist coming?
Yeah, the loyalists have nothing, the loyalists think that they're the bee's knees, there was already long established Bahamian. Yeah.
Okay.
Another example is Alexander Campbell.
Sorry. Alexander Campbell. Oh, right there.
Alexander Campbell's interesting because the name is very general. We found Alexander Campbell records in Loyalists of the Southern Campaign. There was an Alexander Campbell who was captain for the South Carolina Royalists. There was an Alexander Campbell who was a Royal North Carolina Regiment lieutenant. And we also found that there were Campbells in the Bahamas early on. You scroll down a little bit.
Okay.
You'll see
Yes, sorry.
where we found the Campbell name in the 34 census, the 40 census. Now we had to make a decision. Was Alexander Campbell an old family name? Was he a Bahamian or was he a loyalist? In the case of Campbell, we decided to go with that he was Bahamian because of the size of the land. He only received 40 acres. And we doubt that someone who was a lieutenant or a captain in the British Army would have received that small. So that's an example of some of our people we identified with the old family name. The other category we came up with is called others. These were people that didn't fit into any of our categories. They weren't really loyalists. May not have been old Bahamian. A good example of this would be somebody like John Murray, Earl of Dunmore. He was sent to the Bahamas to govern after Great Britain took over the Bahamas. And he was governor here from 1787 to 96. Although he was working for the government of England, we did not call him an American loyalist. He was not actively fighting in the Americas, and he wasn't driven out of the United States. He just became the governor. Before that, early on, he was actually governor of the province of New York. And there is still a lake in Vermont, which used to be part of New York, that's called Dunmore Lake. From there, he was sent to Virginia, and then when the war was lost, he was sent to the Bahamas to go. Another example of someone we call other is Peter Wims.
Check and pull Peter Wims.
And check the spelling. If you haven't checked the spelling on the street, on the Queens Highway, if you're going in one direction, it's Wemness. And if you're going in the other directions, it's Wims. They're completely different spellings.
Scroll down.
Yes.
Okay. Peter Wims was from Scotland. He first went to Nova Scotia in 1785. And after the American Revolution, he moved to the Bahamas in 1790. So he did not fight in the American Revolution. He came with Scotland via Nova Scotia to the Bahamas. So we classified it as other. We only had 12 others, and out of the 344. The last one I'll briefly talk about is William Augustus Bowles. See if we have a picture.
Right here.
There we are. There's a portrait of our William Augustus Bowles.
Yes. Okay.
Go down just a bit more. There he is. Yeah. Very colorful figure. He was born, because I don't remember this. He was born in Maryland in 63. He fought briefly with the Loyalists in the American Revolution, but then he decided he was going off to West Florida. He joined a group of Creek Indians and married the daughter of one of the Indian chiefs. He called himself the Director General of the Muscogee Nation. And he dressed in Indian dress, as you can see. He was described as a soldier, portrait painter, amateur chemist, flautist, actor, many things called himself. So we could not characterize him as really an loyalist. He was not an original Bahamian, but he was aligned himself with Dunmore, therefore received quite a large land. 360. Now, for the next two categories, and then we'll be talking about the presumed late grantees and the
Okay, can you place this in? I'll do it for them. Okay, so. Oh, I can do it from here. I'll just do from here.
Oh, okay.
Everyone,
You have to talk really loud, Nate,
I will.
loud as you can.
Okay, so for this next category, we have the presumed late grantees. And these were people who we placed in this category for two different reasons. So they are both individuals who we can definitively document a land grant dating 1830. And then those for whom we have no grant date, but based upon the fact that their grants were less than 30 acres, we assume that they were late grantees. So anything past the 1830 period, which was our cutoff time for the Loyalists, we placed into the presumed grantee category. So for this, we will look at the sample of Henry Taylor. Just T at the bottom. Okay, and his property is located in Deans. And as you can tell, we don't have much information on him. Our focus is mostly on the earlier inhabitants, identifying the Loyalists from the old inhabitants. So we don't have any information for him other than his land grant being 20 acres given in 1861. So that's why he fell into the category of presumed late grantee, because he was granted this 20 acres in 1861 and also one in 1858. Another person who we'll look at under.
Oh, can I just say,
Yeah.
Henry Taylor is probably the founder of the Taylor family in all of the North. Because otherwise it's Archibald Taylor in the South in Clarencetown we already talked about. So Henry was probably the first Taylor in the North.
Yes. So again, in the presumed grantees list, we will look at William Dean. And William Dean is, property is located in Roses. For his grant, we only have the date that it was granted. We don't have the deed record as listed in some of the others, only that he was granted 80 acres, February 10, 1868. So this also showed that he received his portion of land much later on, as opposed to the others that we spoke about. And then we'll go into the unknown category. And these people we grouped as unknown for two primary reasons. First, because we were unable to identify their names in either any Bahamian records, meaning placing them in the Bahamas prior to the 1780s period, or the second reason, we could not find sufficient enough information on them, or the information that we did find was conflicting because of similar names, for example. And for that, we will look at two persons, Daniel Sutherland, who was an interesting character and a name that we really don't hear in the Bahamas anymore. 1 second. His property was located in McCann's and in the Bight. He received 120 acres on the 1st of February, 1791, and a half an acre the 1st of February, 1791. Okay, so Daniel Sutherland was a merchant. He received, like I mentioned, 120 acres and then a half an acre, which is an unusually small amount compared to everything else we came across. In Boas, just south of the Bight, Sutherland was possibly also granted land of unknown size and the location on December 6, 1789. We have the boundaries listed here. This may not be Crown land, but the thing about Sutherland was we found information on him in Brunel's New Loyalist Index, Volume 5, and it has a person with a similar name, Sutherland, as you see. And we also came across him in documents for Nova Scotia receiving land in Canada, Nova Scotia, Canada, 1765 to 1780. And so because of the conflicting information, we were unable to categorize him as an old inhabitant or a loyalist. So we placed him in unknown until we could locate more information to guide us as to whether he would be listed as a loyalist or an old inhabitant. Another example of our unknown would be John Benzie. And with John Benzie, why we chose to speak about him was because he is listed on our Tatnall map, but he's not listed on the Land and Survey map. So he was given 40 acres on the 8th of July, 1789. Again, like I mentioned, we've made notation that he's not on the Land and Survey map. And he received 40 acres. We actually found his land grant, which you will see here. But at the same time, we were unable to identify if he was an old inhabitant or a loyalist. So the only thing we could go off of and assume that he may have been a loyalist was from the quick rent from his land grants, but that's not sufficient information for us to identify him as a loyalist. Okay, you want to go next?
It's a name.
You're welcome.
Can I?
Oh, yeah.
Because we're not going to use it.
Okay.
We're going to do. Wake up, wake up. The
Yes.
boring part, now that the data part is done. I'm going to sort of summarize what we think we've learned, and hopefully you all can say you're idiots or okay, that's cool new information. So again, back to the main point of this project, we were looking to see if whether the conventional wisdom that the loyalists were the be all end all and life didn't start until the loyalists came, and once they left, life collapsed. Well, no, we don't think so. Our conclusions are as follows. Sorry. Oh, well, I was going to use the map. Oh, well, doesn't matter. So we saw in the colored map, the interactive map showed, we were able to say things about the patterns of the loyalists and the old inhabitants. What we found, first of all, is that if you combine the old inhabitants with the old family names, which are almost certainly old inhabitants, we just couldn't marry the first name, there are 123 of those. The loyalists, 64. So almost twice as many old inhabitants as loyalists. So the old Bahamians were far more important to Long Island's history than the loyalists are. Now this may not, a caveat here, this may not hold true for any of the other out islands in the Bahamas. Long Island is different in so many ways. This may be one of them, or this pattern may in fact hold true everywhere else. So that was a big one. Furthermore, once the loyalists left, their legacy ended. No one was planting cotton anymore. The loyalists either took most of their slaves with them or sold them. So we just don't have loyalists, for the most part, hanging out on Long Island after cotton failed in the early part of the 1800s. On the other hand, the old inhabitants who had been living here before, living in the Bahamas before, they had maybe not a glamorous and maybe not a wealthy way of life, but it was very successful because they were diversified. So if one thing failed, they kept going with all their other things. They did wrecking, which was a really important thing for them. There are stories, the shipwrecks that came off the coast of Long Island. People would run to go salvage the wrecks. Didn't matter who they belonged to necessarily, they took them for themselves. And it became such a big deal. By the middle of the 1800s, one of the preachers at the churches is recorded as having stopped in the middle of his sermon because word of a wreck came and he basically raced his parishioners out to try and salvage the wreck.
Okay.
So that was a big thing. Conking, of course, turtling, whaling, fishing, tree cutting, mahogany and lignite were both very, very hard, dense woods, and they were tremendously valuable. And although we don't really, well, we know mahogany today and maybe an odd lignite here and there, they were very dense and plentiful in the old days. And Harvard University in Massachusetts still has buildings that have mahogany left in it from the Aleutian adventurers. Big trade, long story. Salt, harvesting salt from the salinas is another old inhabitant traditional subsistence activity. Raising livestock, we talked about the outerlies. Subsistence farming, which is not growing 200 acres of cotton. Maybe you have 20 acres, but you grow all your own food. And that's what makes Long Islanders in 1770, in 1870, in 1970, 2022, much more self-sufficient than Nassauians or other people. There is this notion that Long Islanders can take care of themselves with or without government help. Unfortunately, it's often, I'm not saying that anyway. And they were marine traders. They had ships, was very, very oriented to the sea here, just as it is today. Another interesting thing that we found was on Long Island, and we don't know right now if this is true of other out islands, but there were an awful lot of grantees who were women heads of household. They had children, they had slaves, they had plantations, but they were women, and it was in their names. That's not common in the 1780s around anywhere in the Anglo world. So that was very interesting and exciting. So as I mentioned a little bit before, we also realized that a number of the people who came to the Bahamas from Florida in the 1780s were not what we call American loyalists, but were rather what we call West Florida residents or residing in East Florida before the exiled loyalists came. Or they were, as I mentioned, Bahamians who had left Spain, who had left the Bahamas when Spain took over. So when we see these reference books like Talbot Bethel talk about loyalists and name a bunch of names that we know were old inhabitants, we are assuming that these people were Bahamians who left rather than swearing loyalty to the Spanish crown, went to Florida, and then returned, mixed in with all of the other American loyalists who were coming. As I mentioned before, we were able to determine that a handful of families, at least, the Sims, the Majors, the Foxes, the Knowles, the Forsyths, were on Long Island long before 1776, probably as early as 1740. In a colonial office record, which I may explain, is a book of records of sort of letters that were sent between the colonies, which in this case, of course, was Bahamas, to London. One of the records said, a few poor families were living on Long Island by 1776. I think that's interesting because it's those poor families that made it in the end. We also discovered that the Long Island ancestors of the Knowles, Fox, Sims, Mortons, Watkins, Curtises, and others were free Black mulattoes or Negroes. We didn't expect that. So American, as I mentioned, American loyalist grants tended to cluster separately from the old inhabitants. You can see that if you go on the website later on. The first settlements were the Crossing, and they were also Denman's Key. And And they talked about Daniel Sutherland owning a half-acre lot. That was actually granted in anticipation of some sort of densely populated town on Long Island in Old Grays. So those of you who've been to Old Grays know that never exactly happened. And by 1792, that idea was given up. We also noted that many of the early Long Island grantees were of Scottish descent. They were either born in Scotland and come through the American colonies, or they were born in Scotland and came directly here, like Peter Wynn, so I'm a short stay in Nova Scotia. And finally, I did a lot of research in the early Bermuda records, and a lot of the families that we see on Long Island, like for instance, the Hutts and the Adderleys early on, were neighbors in Bermuda. The Smiths were there, Thomas Smith, in fact, the Knowleses were there. Damon Knowles was one of the early Bermuda Knowleses, but we have never been able to conclusively prove that he was the ancestor of John and James Knowles and the rest of that, but I suspect it's going to turn out that way when we can get there. So that's my conclusions. May's going to talk about what's next for a minute, and then we'll have questions and answers.
As you can see so far, a lot of work has been done, and for phase 1. So we intend to continue on with phase 2, 3, in the future. And part of it is, first of all, after this session, we are looking to get more information so that we can update our website and our grant pages. So any input from you guys who are here, who have documentations that could prove otherwise to what we have here already, or can assist us with some of the others and the unknowns, that would be greatly appreciated. And you could send that to us on our webpage. We have a section where you could contact us as well on the website. On the more, yeah. Okay. Also, we would like to work on the second phase, which will be 1810 to 1880s, in which we look at a lot more of those late grantees and try to identify who they were, and piece together their stories like we did with the loyalist settlers and the early inhabitants. And also look more at a lot of the census after the 1740 census, in which we spoke a lot about, and continue on from there. We'll also look at more deeds and indentures. We do have a large accumulation of them, but because of time constraints, we were not able to fully go through them all and add them to this project. So that would be a part of our next phase of this project. And then that would lead us to another portion which we would like to do, which is the lands that still have standing ruins. Because we speak about these people, but they also had these plantations, and for the most part, a lot of these plantations are still intact, not fully intact, but in ruins on a lot of the properties here. So we would like to identify those and highlight those on our map to show where they are, and even possibly include photos to see what they look like today. We'd like to also potentially assist landowners or AMC or tourism into developing a heritage tourism program with our project here on our website. And so that's basically in a nutshell what we look to do for the future. So any assistance would be much appreciated. We are open to comments, criticisms, suggestions, ideas, all of the above. So anything else? Okay, so we're ready for questions and answers. Thank you so much.
I don't know how this works exactly with the probably 2 people who left on Zoom, but I suppose you guys can ask questions, I assume. Oh, good.
I kind of read somewhere that in order to get a grant on a family house, you had to take, or you would get this property, you would take a property of a family house to get a more valuable property.
It's very possible. I mean, we have, as I said, I think probably Jackie may have said as early as the beginning, we don't, just because we know who owned the land We don't know if they were living here specifically. We have a lot of instances where we have a pretty good idea they were living here, but it's very likely that some of these people simply took what they were eligible to get and then turned around and sold it or what have, traded it for land on where they really wanted to be. And some of these loyalists may have really wanted to be on Nassau rather than this out island, Long Island. I don't have a record of that. We didn't really pursue that as a topic, but it sounds very logical. I mean, we've assumed all along that some of these people did that, you know, came here and used the land not to live on, not to produce cotton, but to sell or trade.
In order to get something else.
Exactly. Because as you all know, the land here was not terribly valuable after about 1802. The chenille bug wiped out a lot of cotton. It stained it so they couldn't use it. And in those instances where even the chenille bug didn't wipe out the cotton, the land was so poor, as it is today, not great, huge productive soil, that if you continually tilled it and used it for cotton more than a couple of years, the productivity dropped to next to nothing. So it was not great land here for doing a lot, except for the old inhabitants, because they knew where it was at.
If you identify natural locations of fresh water,
Nope, haven't looked at that. I mean, there's so much that can be done on Long Island. This
that's
took us 12
a
years.
good basis for-
Yeah, and now that we know where every piece of land was and who owned every piece of land, there are a million student projects, PhDs, master, you could do anything with the data that we've created. And I guess we should probably tell you that we did this free of charge, and our gift is to the people of the Bahamas and to the Long Islanders. And once we walk away today, it's yours. Anybody's open public to use in any way you want. We hope the schools will use it. And Anae mentioned a bit about the potential for tourism. Colin Brooker, who is the architectural historian that Jackie mentioned, who's an expert in Bahamian historic architecture, said that when he was here, that Long Island has more intact 18th century, that is 1700s, ruins than any of the other islands in Bahamas put together. This island is ripe for that industry. It's huge. Think about Egypt, the Mayans in Mexico. This is a huge billion-dollar industry, and Long Island could do so much more with it. I mean, there's so much that could be done. Ann Knowles already has a collective location of at least 19 standing plantation ruins. Now with our map, we know exactly who they belong to, where the people came from. I mean, there's so much potential there. Sorry, I know it's digressing from your topic, but any other questions? Yes.
Did you guys build the website yourself?
Did we build the website? We did everything ourselves. And you may have noticed that Jackie and I are not spring chickens. We're not technology savvy. And they did a lot, but also Jennifer Hackett really was the prime mover, who's our invisible fourth partner who's here. Yay, Jennifer. Jennifer was, yes, exactly. Jennifer did all of the GIS, all the mapping. She did, she led the effort for the website entirely. And I need to tell you, we were still adding things last night. Jennifer has been a trooper.
Definitely.
What's that?
Definitely.
Yes, definitely a trooper
Definitely.
putting up with us. And it's funny because Jennifer would look at the historic document and say, I don't know what that says, I don't read history. And we're like, technology? Yeah, we don't know technology. So it's actually turned out to be a good mix, but yes, our team did the website entirely.
It's not really on topic, but when the emancipation happened, what happened to all the slaves?
Good question. The question is, when emancipation happened, what in 1834, what happened to all the slaves? There was a time period of 4 years.
Yeah.
So between 1834 and 1838, the law of the Bahamas said that the former slaves had to be given an apprenticeship. So their previous owners had to teach them a trade. I mean, a real trade. They really had to teach them, not just like, there you go. And so they were apprenticed for 4 years. And then most of them were given the option to buy land. What we know today as Upper Tatnalls.
And by locals, Tatlin, sorry.
Tatlin, oh, I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
So Tatlin and Tatnalls was in fact a place where there were many, many 20-acre grants. And those were all the former slaves. And they all had familiar names. They were Adderleys, they were Knowles, they were Smiths, they were, what's that? Hardings, yes, exactly. Hardings are interesting. We really wanted them to be, earlier, but they turned out to be presumably grantees. We may be able to find a better time, but so far that's that.
This is the main board.
Gordon, yes, we have Gordons, and that's what we were gonna offer. Anyone who is interested can either look this up on the website, or they can come up to us individually after the public thing here is done, and we can look up the family name that you're interested in. So if you're interested in Gordon, come on up afterwards and we'll show you what we know. Probably not a ton right now, but yeah, we did. Other questions? Are there online questions? How do
What about the Darville family? How far can that be traced in the island?
Darvils? Oh, very interesting family. Darvils were here pretty early on. We have them, not surprisingly, in the area between Devon's Key and, well, a lot in Devon's Key, between Devon's Key and Clarencetown, which is pretty much where they're focused today. And the Darvils, we can go back to 1704. John Darville was reported as a pirate. Ah, boy. And he was from a family that was Marmaduke, John, and they kept recycling these names. But John Darville was listed by his father as a pirate who had been already listed by the government. But then when they said, where are these people now? Have they given up pirating? He said, my son John has gone up pirating again. So he was an inveterate pirate, but we don't know before that. I have a sneaking suspicion that a name called Darrell, Darrell, was in fact Darville. And there are lots of instances of this where names have changed slightly. And today you have Darrells and you have Darvilles that may have just been one person, one family name.
Hardings and Harding.
Oh, Harding, exactly. Two separate groups now. Darville sounds French, but we have not been able to trace Darvilles back beyond 1704 from Bahamas. But they are definitely an old inhabited family doing lots of important things in that area between Devon's Key and Clarencetown.
Okay, another.
Just a sec, we're going to take some questions from.
Okay, one more from online. I'm researching Bryce and Boyer, Long Island. How have you come across these surnames?
Okay, so someone online is asking about Bryce and Boyer. We have a Bryce, David, Andrew, or
Yeah,
David Andrew, I think, Bryce.
Bryce.
So yeah, check the website for sure. We don't have a Boyer. I've definitely come across it, but incidentally, we didn't really write anything down because we were specifically focused just on our 344 Long Island grantees.
And Bryce was a late grantee.
And Bryce was a late grantee.
Yeah.
Exactly. I should say now that our website is www. It's a long one, Long Island Bahamas History.com.
Yes. I already sent it.
Okay,
Thanks.
so and they just typed in the link on Zoom, right?
Yes, it's
On Zoom, and it again, once again, is www.longislandbahamashistory.com. Okay, more audience questions? Yes.
Just a history lesson. When did the British consider the Bahamas a colony? How early?
The dawn of time. No, there was early on in the 15 and 1600s. There was lots of jockeying back and forth between Spain and the Netherlands and France and Great Britain, and or what was then probably England. I don't know the date that this formally became English, but the Lords Proprietor were a group of British lords, royalties, minor royalty, who were granted management of the islands before 1680. That's about all I can tell you. We have it written down somewhere, but I don't have it memorized in my head, but a long time ago.
So there were a lot of people on Long Island.
There were a lot of people on Long Island, and this is just counting the people who ended up in historic records. I'm sure that this was heavily visited by pirates and other people just wandering around in the West Indies. It would have been, we have great harbors here. It would have been a really good place to hang out. We have mangrove swamps where you can come and hide a boat. So, yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your interest and support, and go play on the website. Cookies and water in that.